I am delighted once again to be joined by Cormac Smith. He, as an expert who's worked in public relations and corporate communications for over 3 decades, and he has an absolutely unique experience. In 2016, he traveled to Ukraine to take up a special appointment as the strategic communication advisor to Pavlo Klimkin, then the foreign minister of Ukraine. He was attached to the British embassy in Kyiv, but was embedded in Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is an absolutely unique experience and a unique insight into the practices of governance and communication in Ukraine. We're going to be talking about something slightly different today, but also related, which is the slide towards autocracy and indeed the fragility of democracy, especially when we have authoritarians aligning in an aggressive fashion around the world. We'll get into that in a minute, but thank you to everyone in the audience. Thank you to everyone who subscribes, who supports the channel, adds comments, and also of course, a huge thank you to everyone who is supporting the current campaign that we're running. We are going to Ukraine next week. We are driving some trucks over, which we crowdsourced over Christmas. Many of you will have seen that. We're actually driving these over, and then we're going to be running events in Lviv and Kiev. But all this stuff costs. Hiring the film crew, getting the materials professionally edited so that we can make them available to the channel. This will cost. We've got a fundraiser at the moment simply to cover the cost of that, to be able to make these materials free to the channel and not include adverts in them. So if you've helped, thank you so much. And if you're able to help, then it is massively, massively appreciated. Well, without further ado, let's get into the conversation. Cormac, welcome back.
Jonathan, it's always a great pleasure to join you and to be back on Silicon Curtain. And if I can just say before we start, huge congratulations on the Ukrainian project and and Godspeed with your upcoming trip to Lviv and Kyiv.
There's a lot going on. There's the film project. There's this, when we're going to film materials. I've got a book in the pipeline as well, based on the Silicon Cut interviews. It does all feel a little bit like I'm spinning plates, but I think it's worth it. Let's jump into the topic, which is democracy. Now, before we talk about the authoritarian alignment that is trying to undermine democracy and rules-based order, let's look at the fundamentals, because you've been looking at some of the structure of world democracy, and it seems, unfortunately, that whereas democratic, let's say, evolution was on the rise during the 80s and especially the 90s, it seems that there has been a certain amount of backsliding and that actually democracy is in abeyance. What's the impression you get from the figures you've seen?
Yeah, Jonathan, I was reading something called the Economist Intelligence Update, and they estimate that less than 6.5% of the world's population live under what you and I here in the West would recognize as a full democracy. A further 39% would live under what they call imperfect democracies. Now, that would include hugely populous countries like India, Brazil, South Africa also, but very worryingly, also the United States of America. But, I'm sure there are people, certainly our American friends, who might want to push back against that. But, even if we were to shift with figures like that, even if we were to shift the United States into the perfect democracies category, that still leaves considerably less than 1 in 10 of the world's population living under democracy. And of course, what the intelligence update has recorded is there has been a significant decline in population living under democracy of some 4% since 2020. So the the democracy and the human rights that folks like you and I, quite frankly, have grown up to take for granted, are not the norm. And we live in a world now where autocracies are very much on the rise and in the ascendant. And we talk about the axis of evil of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and then we look at various countries in the south who might be nominally imperfect democracies, but are at best And I'm thinking, for example, of an India, are at best sitting on the fence and waiting to fall into the lap of what I will keep calling the axis of evil. So, the final thing that I would say about that is, the Kremlin for well over a decade has made absolutely no secret of its disdain for what we call our rules-based international order. And of course, I always go back to Sergei Lavrov. I only became aware of this. You talked about Ukraine, you talked about Ukraine. One of the things that Ukraine taught me, I graduated from a good university with a politics degree 40 years ago now. And I never really encountered the term rules-based international order until I went to Ukraine in 2016. It was the Ukrainians who impressed on me the importance of the rules-based international order and how it was under threat. And of course, it was Sergei Lavrov in early 2017 at the Munich Security Conference who made a speech where he exulted, I would say, in the coming asunder of our rules-based order, and he hailed the rise of the post-West era. Very few people were listening at the time. I certainly was because of what I was doing and the people that I was working with. But it seems to me, and as you know, I do a lot of media interviews, probably about 300 in the last 3 years, covering Russia's war against Ukraine. So, as well as doing interviews, I'm a great consumer of the media, especially if it's related to the war in Ukraine or indeed the Middle East or anything to do with the Axis. And it's only, I would say, in the last year that increasingly I have heard substantial or significant figures, former diplomats, current government figures, former generals, current generals, talk about the rules-based order and the threat that it is under. We're waking up very, very late, Jonathan.
Mm. And let's dig into this because, of course, we have lots of these phrases and concepts which, now that we're paying attention, seem to occur a lot in Russian propagandistic narratives. They occur a lot when Lavrov talks and others. Patrushev, although he's an odd kind of figure in a mixture of harsh truths and absolute delusional fantasy at the same time. And then you have people like Dugin, who are the supposedly intellectual communicators. But underlining it, there seems to be a similar kind of concept that cuts across all of these. They talk about multipolarity. They talk about ending U.S. hegemony. They talk about there's all sorts of stuff there, of course, about ending the colonial grip of the US, which of course is ironic. So these are the concepts which you could almost think are I won't say clean, but they're sort of intellectualized, scrubbed up, so they don't feel quite so fascistic. You also have this term Eurasianism, which I think we still struggle to understand. But in the Russian context, maybe it makes a little bit more sense, except it doesn't because it's ludicrous. They have these concepts, but how do you translate that into the actual mechanics of power? Because before we hit and record, you and I know that there's only one thing you need to keep your eye on if you want to understand all the froth of Russian politics. That is power and the hierarchy of power. Who sits where in that vertical power structure, and how is that power manifested internally and externally? That's all you need to observe. So what's all this other stuff? What are all these other concepts? And what do they mean in practice? What does Russia want to achieve through Eurasianism, multipolarity, ending US hegemony?
Let's try and unpick this in simple terms that people can understand. And as you say, it is about power. Now, we have a rules-based international order, and I have had many conversations, both with journalists and very intelligent friends who scoff at the concept of a rules-based international order, and of course they're very fond to bring up the debacle in Iraq over maybe weapons of mass destruction and the exit from Afghanistan and various other mistakes, quite honestly, that our leaders have made over the last 80 years. And the fact that we need to remind ourselves is our rules-based international order is not perfect, and our leaders have made mistakes. But as democracies, we are capable of learning from our mistakes and we are capable of improving. So, I think it's very, very simple at the end of the day. Do you want to live in a imperfect but improving rules-based order? And that's a choice that's in all of our hands in the West as democratic countries. And it's a pressure we can put on our leaders. Or would you like to live in a Russia, a North Korea, Iran, or a China and live under the sort of human rights abuses and the sort of regimes that pertain in those countries? I think if you look at it in those stark concepts, in those stark terms, the choice becomes fairly easy. But to go back and answer your question, what's it about? It's about power. And, our rules-based order, which we've already said, I'm the first to say it, it is imperfect and we need to do better. But if it stands for one thing, it stands for the fact that a powerful neighbor cannot simply invade another sovereign country to take what they want by force. You and I, Jonathan, grew up thinking that we had consigned those things to the history books when we looked at the history of the Second World War and so forth. And we need to remind people that the first European country to be invaded by force since 1945 was Ukraine by Russia. So that is a central and immutable um, 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 standard of the rules-based order. And of course, this does not suit the autocracies. There are also below that, there are the levels of human rights which we enjoy in our democracies, which clearly are not enjoyed in these other countries. But we have and I'm trying very hard to simplify this. We have a Vladimir Putin who said in the last century that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. The Soviet Union, or the USSR, was a Russian empire. It was 15 Soviet socialist republics, as you know, of which Russia was one, Ukraine was one, but it was very much a Russian empire. And to really understand that, you need to spend time, as you and I have, with Ukrainians, with people from the Baltics, from Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and indeed from Poland, which was not part of the USSR, but was firmly behind the Iron Curtain. And you need to speak to people who grew up under those regimes to know what it meant. A very good Ukrainian diplomat friend of mine said to me one night, we were late in the office having a drink at the end of a very long week, and he said, Cormac, it's not it's not that we want the riches and the wealth that some think the European Union will provide. It's far more important what we are trying to get away from. So, yes, a rules-based order, it's imperfect, but we don't invade other countries to take them over. And yes, we've made mistakes and we need to learn from our mistakes. But we need to see in very stark terms the choices we have to live in our current democratic systems and realize the rights that we have and the opportunity that we all have as citizens in democracies to do better. Or we can look at the reality of living in a Russia, a China, a North Korea, or an Iran. I can't put it any I can't put it any more starkly than that to people who tell me that the people who enjoy the benefits of our democratic societies, who will be very quick to tell me that the concept of a rules-based international order is actually a sham.
I can already see, I mean, the trolls love this. There is a certain strain of libertarian thinking that loves to say that actually, just let's get rid of all the rules, let's be free. And I think that requires some serious pushback. The idea that an absence of rules is freedom, it's insanity. This is the Musk flavor. It's where autocrats and oligarchs have free reign to exert influence and manipulate. So let's get down to, so it's about power, it's about control. Russia doesn't necessarily want to erase the United States, but I think Russia certainly wants to feel that they are at the big table. They have a seat at the table. They're taken seriously. They are looked upon with fear and awe, and considered to be a great power. That's what they want to get back to, is great power status. And they want a world where great powers make the rules, uh, and this concept of sovereign democracies. I think what they mean by that phrase is that you're only sovereign if you have the military power to protect your borders. If you're a small country, then the concept of sovereignty does not apply to you. That would be the Baltics, one would guess Romania, Moldova, and all these others are not seen by Putin's elite as sovereign. What's the end logic of this? The end logic, surely, is that if you view these countries as either not sovereign or puppets, or within the sphere of larger ones, then what you end up with is some very large power blocks. The US, Russia and its so-called Eurasian Empire, China, and possibly the EU if it gets its act together. But that would suggest that you end up with a small number of power blocks, possibly India, as well. Is this the kind of vision you think Putin wants? And why would such a world of competing power blocks benefit Russia, its elite, and its business model?
Jonathan, I see things in slightly simpler terms than that. I think Putin wants fundamentally three things. He wants to put the Russian Empire back together. I think that has now got to be clear, both in it's been demonstrated in words and deeds. With Ukraine, he wants to wipe Ukraine off the face of the map. He wants to extinguish any semblance of Ukrainian national identity, and this has been said by Putin and his cronies in the Kremlin for well over 10 years. As another great Ukrainian friend of mine reminded me only days after the full-scale invasion back in 22, if Russia stops fighting, there will be no war. If Ukraine stops fighting, there will be no Ukraine. And the Ukrainians understand this very, very well. The greatest threat, and let's just go off on a tangent and I'll come back because I'm on point one of three. He wants to put the Russian Empire back together. Um, the reason we had all the disinformation that the reason for the invasion was NATO expansion. It was Ukraine was full of Nazis. It was the civil war in Donbass, aligned to the persecution of the Russian-speaking minority, and of course we have that great one that the Maidan revolution was a US-backed coup. None of these have any truth in them at all, but they have gained great currency among many in the West, among useful idiots, and unfortunately among some of our political leaders as well. The reason for the invasion is that the greatest threat to the existence of the Kremlin, which is a kleptocratic regime based on mafia and KGB principles, was the greatest threat to the existence of Putin, his wealth, and the wealth of his cronies was a successful democratic Ukraine on their doorstep, because that just might send a message which might one day actually connect with the Russian people, that they could do the same as their Ukrainian brothers and sisters who were clearly heading for a much better quality of life than they were. That was pure and simple. So the first point was what Putin wants. He wants to put the Russian Empire back together. If America, as the world's policeman, as they acted for many years, is the principal part of the bloc opposing Russia in the form of NATO, he can't do that. So the second thing I believe that Putin wants to do and has invested hugely in, probably for over 20 years, is to break America away from the rest of Europe. And that is something that, we all wait with bated breath to see what will happen after the 20th of January when Donald Trump comes into the White House for the second time, and there have been threats to pull out of NATO. There have been threats to pull the rug out from under Ukraine and so forth. This is very much what Putin hopes, and Putin is, the war is going very badly for Putin. The Russian economy is in free fall, but we know Putin is holding on and hoping for the best. It's a discussion for another day, but it just may not work out that way. Trump might not do exactly as Putin wants or expects. So that's the second thing that Putin wants. He wants to break America away. And the third thing is to weaken the European Union. Because the European Union, correct me if I'm wrong, certainly before Britain left in 2016, must have been the largest trading bloc on earth. Something which Donald Trump is not too happy with either, because the European Union, as part of the European Union and 500,000 people in developed democracies, we can stand up to anybody and we can get a good deal with anyone. Now, we know there was Russian money involved in the Brexit campaign, and we know that the breaking up of the European Union, or the weakening of the European Union, is something which is hugely to Putin's favor. And we have the examples of Orban in Hungary and Fico in the Czech Republic, who are effectively Putin or Kremlin allies within the European Union. So for me, it's that simple. There's three things that Putin wants: break America away, put the Russian Empire back together. And in order to do that, he needs to break America away, and he needs to significantly weaken the European Union. The challenge for us in Europe is to keep America in the game, and I believe there is a deal to be done. Because if America was to pull out tomorrow, absolutely, I think the fact is that the European Union and the European Union members of NATO alone are not capable of filling the gap. So in Europe, we need to find a way to keep America in the game. I believe there's a deal to be done with Donald Trump. The cost of that deal is going to be European members of NATO spending an awful lot more on defence. The UK is currently the leading defence spender in relative terms at 2.3%. Mark Rutte, the new Secretary General of NATO, made a very important speech that some may have missed on the 12th of December. And he said, that if we don't spend more now, the cost later is going to be much, much, much higher. And I counted it. He used three muches. And, in that speech, he was suggesting 3% as the baseline. Now, since we've heard Donald Trump coming out with 5%, I think what we know about Donald Trump and how he tries to put people off balance and make deals, that is probably his opening bid. But I do believe there's a deal to be done, and I do believe that the price of that deal will be 3%. And that is going to impact all of us across Europe. It is going to impact on our standard of living. Look at it here in the UK, Jonathan, where where the economy is not in great shape, and we have a cost of living crisis for many, many people, and we're at 2.3%. If we get up to 3%, that money is going to have to come from somewhere, and it is going to mean there is no magic money tree. It's going to mean that there are going to be some essential services which are not going to be funded. And our government at the moment doesn't appear to be in a position to recognize that reality. But Jonathan, you know me, and I like my sound bites. And one of my sound bites I've been deploying over the last year, I think, and I believe this, it is our money and guns today, or our daughters and sons tomorrow. And that seemed to be exactly what Mark Rutte was telling other NATO members on the 12th of December last year.
And he followed that up last week with a very punchy phrase. And of course, this has more meaning in Europe than it does even to us, because parts of Europe, of course, were occupied by German forces. And the idea of learning German was something incredibly immediate to people whose grandparents may have been forced to do that or hear German at the end of the barrel of a gun. He came out and said, if you don't want to be learning Russian in 5 years' time, that struck me as an incredibly forceful phrase that's going to have an impact in Europe if it doesn't have an impact here. My reading of this is like, oh, oops, if you speak Russian already, that's pretty bad because, we're going to be the first ones up against the wall. If Russia was to occupy territory, we're goners because we have a better understanding of the mechanics of the Russian state.
And there is a delusion that those of us on the western extremities of Europe are safer and don't need to worry. And people will tell me that we're not going to see Russian tanks rolling down Pall Mall or Oxford Street or Park Lane or wherever. But again, that's to completely misunderstand what Russia has been doing for well over 10 years when they have been waging war on us. It's been a hybrid war of what is now being talked of as a grey zone war. And again, I talked at the beginning of this conversation, Jonathan, about the fact that it's only it's only recently in the last year that I hear a lot of big influential figures talking about the threat to our rules-based order. In the same way, it's really only in the last year that I'm starting to hear more and more people talk about the reality of Russian hybrid warfare, which has been waged against us for well over 10 years. And as we know, we've seen the assassination attempts, and in fact, one unfortunate lady murdered in 2018 in the attempt on the life of Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury. We have seen cyber attacks. We know there has been interference in elections both in the UK and in the United States and across Europe. The Netherlands, in particular, is one state that comes to mind. And we know that there are a multitude of ways that Russia interferes to sow dissent within our societies. So it's the more dominant that Russia becomes, and the more they gain in the eastern neighborhood, it is going to have an effect on us. And the consensus seems to be that we need to be ready to fight a war against Russia by the end of this decade. And I would quote, was it General Sir Roland Walker, who was the current head of the British Army, who said just before Christmas in October, I think it was, he said, the British Army is not ready to fight. And if we're not ready to fight, we're not ready to deter. And this is Britain, who, as I say, in percentage terms, leads Europe in defence spending, who has, without a doubt, and something as an Irishman that I'm hugely proud of, has been at the absolute forefront of supporting Ukraine back in late 2022. Flying in the lightweight NLAWs, the anti-tank weapons, which were probably more than any other single piece of kit responsible for winning the Battle of Kyiv and actually, saving the capital. And Ukrainian friends have told me, it's not just what you Brits give us; it's the leadership that you have displayed behind the scenes to marshal and encourage other nations to get on board with supporting Ukraine. I've been told that since early 2022. So yeah, we are in a very, very perilous state at the moment. And if we wait, as I've said, to see what happens after the 20th of January, but if Putin is allowed to have any victory in Ukraine, and I believe being allowed to keep any of Ukrainian sovereign territory, including the land that he has already taken, which is close to, I think, 20% of Ukrainian land, this will be something which he will very, very easily spin as a victory to his people. We know We know that Putin always negotiates in bad faith and always goes on to break his word, certainly with anything to do with Ukraine, going right back to the Budapest Memorandum in 1994. So it really is very critical what happens. And we know Donald Trump talks about making a deal and stopping the war and the horrendous level of deaths on both sides. But we need to see this in a different way. We need to get an awful lot more, I would say, maximalist in terms of how we're dealing with Russia, because Russia is choking at the moment. They are bleeding out. Their economy is in free fall. I looked at the casualty figures according to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense yesterday. 811,000 either killed or mortally wounded, or wounded to a life-changing, but taken out of the battle completely in less than 3 years. They have been losing. And what's very, very interesting while I'm on this point, in case somebody listening in says, "Oh, this is counter narrative and this is lies and so forth." What I've noticed 3 years ago, intelligence sources in the West were estimating far, far lower Russian losses. Intelligence sources in the West, including British intelligence and American intelligence, are now almost in complete alignment with the estimates of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense. The last figure I heard quoted was between 14 and 1600 a day. To put that into context for people, in Afghanistan in the 70s, in 10 years, the USSR lost 17,000. They are losing that number in 10 days in Ukraine and have been doing so consistently for most of the second half of 2024. Yes, they have been making small incremental advances, but they have been making these advances at massive human cost. How long can this be sustained? Probably not much longer. It is probably time to put the boot in on Russia and break Russia's back. Unfortunately, Ukraine on her own is probably not capable of doing that. And we have not supported Ukraine sufficiently from the start. I've said this before to you, Jonathan, and many other people. We have given them just enough to keep them in the fight, but not enough to deliver the lockout blow. So frightened have we been by the well over 100 times that Putin has rattled the nuclear saber, which most experts now agree he simply will not act on because he can't. It is not in his interest. And there are many reasons for that.
And China, there's reasonably good evidence that China has said that that for them is an absolute red line and would have
Absolutely.
communicated that forcefully. And I think this is interesting to note because both China and the US probably have it within their power to break Putin's regime. If China was to put a complete embargo on Russian hydrocarbons and withdraw all credits, financial support, I mean, they're not going to, but if they were, that's a massive lever of the regime. Similarly, Trump has numerous, not just military levers, but financial levers, which could break the Russian economy, break Putin's war machine. What is endlessly fascinating to me and a cause of deep shame is that even now, there are new packages of sanctions being announced, and it comes to light that there are new loopholes or existing loopholes in the sanctions regime, especially the hydrocarbons regime. The cap needs to be reduced to further reduce Russian profit, and we need to tackle the grey fleet. There are so many things we have not done, and we're at 3 years of the war, still announcing incremental sanctions. Leads me to think, why the hell wasn't this stuff done much, much sooner? If this was timed when Ukraine had retaken Kyiv and the Kherson region, and then these sanctions had gone in full strength at that time, we probably could have ended this and Putin's imperial ambitions by now. Um, yeah, I mean, just the point there. What do you think of
Could
that?
I, well,
And
look, could I cut in? I saw a tweet yesterday from one Joseph Biden, and he reflected that at the outbreak of the war, he saw he had two objectives. The first objective was to help Ukraine resist the Russian invasion, but the second objective was to avoid nuclear war with Russia. Absolutely despicable and deluded. I go back to it was former General Wesley Clark, who was the former commander of NATO. And Wesley Clark spoke at a security conference in Kyiv in 2022. And I listened to it online and I noted what he said. And he said three things. He said, give Ukraine everything they need to defend themselves. And he specifically said at the time, including F-16s and A-10s. Well, we know how long it's taken to get F-16s to Ukraine, and the A-10, the great warthog, which I'm sure the Ukrainians could have made great use of and are lying in great numbers in storage and not being used by America anymore. Neither of those two things happened. That was the first thing he said. The second thing he said was give Putin no off ramp and no sanctuary behind his own borders. We saw how long it took to even grant the Ukrainians the most limited permission to use Western supplied long range weapons, in particular Atacam, Storm Shadow, and Scalp, to hit Russian military targets from where daily murderous attacks are and were being launched against Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure. But the third thing that he said that was remarkable, and this was, I can check the date, it was either June or July of 22. He said, do not be intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats. Well, that tweet from Mr. Biden yesterday tells us exactly that from the very, very start. Mr. Biden and Mr. Sullivan and who's um, the third horseman of the disastrous American
there's
apocalypse,
Blinken, who one
Anthony
suspects
Blinken.
hasn't
Yes,
had
yes,
much influence, really. He
yeah,
could have been more
yeah,
hawkish, but he's gone along with this soft appeasement.
yeah. And that has been that for me. When I saw that, that really summed up where we have gone wrong. And I was on a person, betraying my own politics. I was a great fan of Joe Biden and I expected much from him. And we heard many, many fine words from Joe Biden from the start. But ultimately, the Biden administration has has let Ukraine down badly, and has cost tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives. As I say, we wait to see what happens. But quite frankly, I'm not sure that it can be any worse under a Donald Trump. As I've said, I believe there's a deal to be done. The day after he was elected, I did a podcast on a different channel, and I said there may be a silver lining for Ukraine in this, and that silver lining may be the final awakening of European leaders, because America will want to. You talked about China, and yes, Donald Trump has the power to break Russia, break China. Not sure he has the power to do both at the same time. So the Trump administration will pivot to the Far East and the Middle East to a certain extent, but certainly to the Far East, and the focus on China's ambitions in Taiwan. And they will expect, and he has said this, they will expect Europe to look after Ukraine. And so we should. If there's again betraying my politics, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but if there is one area and one area only that I find myself in strong agreement with Donald Trump, is that European members of NATO have simply not done enough. We have freeloaded. And as an Irishman, the concept of defense freeloading is something which I understand all too well. But, Ireland's defense posture, I think, let's not get into that and open that can of worms. That's a conversation that we could have on a different day, but is significant for Europe nevertheless. So there's a deal to be done. We need to keep America in the game for the time being while we tool up effectively. We should have put our industries on a war footing 3 years ago. We started to do it last year. These things take time. The military industrial complex takes time to get the wheels rolling. We have the capability in Europe, but it's going to take us more time. We need to buy time. To buy time, we need to keep America in the game. And to do that, we're going to have to pay 3% minimum, I believe. It's not a prediction. I'm not in the prediction game, but it is my assessment.
Yeah, 3.5% is the sort of figure that's been bantered around informally, I think, in the Trump camp, which is where the end goal is to end up. That, of course, is a huge transformation in Western budgets. It requires very grown-up conversations between our leaders and their electorates. I'm not sure all the leaders, including in the UK, are up for that at the moment or realize the necessity of it. Let's get on to another theme here because I think, of course, there'll be those who say that Trump is an out and out Russian asset. I'm coming to the view that that's not necessarily a given, but that he certainly has admiration for what autocratic, authoritarian techniques can achieve. He has a certain amount of respect for the individuals. And I think, on the sort of in the sort of slightly left universe, we immediately interpret that respect that he agrees and will do absolutely the same thing and he'll kowtow to them. That's not necessarily the case. So if we flip that, how's Russia looking at Trump? They may think in certain respects he's better than Biden, Clinton, and that lot. In certain respects, they may look at it and realize that they actually have challenges. Therefore, if you're a Kremlin strategist, what are you going to do? What has Putin done in the past? Well, his go-to strategy since he got into office, and indeed this was already in place in the 90s and it was used and abused by Yeltsin to an extent as well, and that is to create legislative ambiguity, judicial ambiguity, so that if you're running a business, if you're doing something, you are by default committing a crime because the laws conflict with each other and they won't prosecute you until your loyalty is in question, and then they have all the material they need. So Putin's trick is to make you complicit in criminality so he has leverage over you. He's done it with the Russian elites. He's done it with the Russian population. He's done it with propagandists and journalists. Once, whether you agree with the regime or not, and especially if you oppose the regime, once you're complicit in criminality, it's very hard to be a fully organic, independent oppositionist. With Trump's statements around Canada and Greenland, it seems to me that this is a perfect opportunity, possibly the idea even seeded by Russian agents, to make the US complicit in extreme criminality and therefore peel it off from its allies. I rather suspect that the Middle East conflagration that happened last year was another attempt to peel people away from the US. They knew that Israel's response was going to be huge. They knew Israel's response was going to be, in some respects, disproportionate. They knew there'd be instances of war crimes taking place. That's guaranteed. So it fits their purpose because it means that the Western allies are seen to be hypocrites, and it's a way of dividing and conquering internally. And they are already doing this. Russian propaganda is saying, well, look, if America takes Greenland, well, why can't we have a chunk? Or why are you criticizing us for Crimea if you're going to go and do this? The same will work with Taiwan as well. And this comes back to the title of the episode, The Rules-Based Disorder. Russia seems intent on involving everyone in its criminality to erode what we have been terming the rules-based order and concept of sovereignty.
So, Jonathan, look, you have made a number of points there. Speaking with you, always a great pleasure and an exercise in mental gymnastics. So let me peel them off. Let us, for the moment, put Greenland, Canada, and even Panama, which you didn't mention. Let's put that to one side. Come back if you want, by all means. If I were in the Kremlin at the moment, I think I would be looking at the prospect of Trump 2 with a great degree of trepidation. I am not sure that the situation that pertains today is what pertained, say, back in 2019, which was the last time which Trump met Putin. At that time, um, Trump was having very significant problems. He was under impeachment, and Putin was arguably riding very, very high. Now, there is a whole issue of what compromat um, 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 Putin may have on Trump, and certainly intelligence sources, both in Ukraine and the UK that I have spoken to, would tend to confirm the likelihood that there is compromat, and we don't need to go into the salacious details of that compromat, but it probably exists. The point is this: Donald Trump has never been more powerful in his entire life. He has not just won the Electoral College, he has won the popular vote for the first time for a Republican president, and I don't know how many years, in many, many years. He controls both houses, and he clearly is riding on a great populist wave for his policies in the United States. I'll remind you that it was a couple of months before Christmas, shortly after Donald Trump was elected, there were reportedly discussions between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. This was later denied. It's likely that there was discussions at some level between Trump's people and Putin's people. It was reported that the US side had instructed Russia not to escalate in Ukraine. What followed was an immediate escalation with some horrendous missile attacks on various Ukrainian cities. But also the day following, there were naked pictures of Trump's wife published all over the internet. Now, that, to anybody I have spoken to, and to my understanding, was a very, very clear signal that we have this stuff on you. The same Donald Trump has just been convicted in an American court, but he won't face any punishment for that because he's the president elect and so forth. If there's ever been a Teflon president, it's Donald Trump. I don't think Donald Trump cares, quite frankly, about whatever compromat that the Russians have. They can only use it once. It's the threat of compromat that tends to work. And I simply don't think that threat works anymore. So with Donald Trump, you have got to remember you deal with somebody who is transactional. He's not, I would suggest, driven by any particular ideology or moral compass. One of the first things I learned in my working life was a boss that I had when I first came to the UK told me that the most important thing to work out was what everybody does and says everything for a reason. The most important thing to work out was what that reason was. So the most important thing to work out with Donald Trump is what Donald Trump actually wants. So, you mentioned Greenland and you mentioned Canada. My own belief of this is, Donald Trump is unpredictable. He's also a great disruptor, and he will throw stuff like that out to put what he sees as opponents, because everybody's an opponent to Trump. When you're making a deal, everybody's an opponent, and he will throw that stuff out to put opponents off balance. But I don't think we need to worry about that too much at the moment. We need to come back to what does Donald Trump want? And I think China is increasingly of interest and importance to Donald Trump. And as I have said, he will want to pivot his forces towards the Far East and towards China's interest in Taiwan. For that, he will need to pull out of Europe to a certain extent. The deal to be done is to keep Donald Trump in and the United States in Europe. So I am a lot more optimistic than I would have been 3 months ago or 6 months ago. And quite frankly, on behalf of my Ukrainian friends, I dreaded the prospect of a second Donald Trump presidency simply because of what he had said he would do and how he would end the war within 24 hours. And he would do this quite obviously by simply forcing a deal on Ukraine and pulling all the support away. I have noticed a far more, and this is not, we don't you normally use the word Donald Trump and nuanced in the same sentence, but I would say I have noticed in recent weeks a more nuanced tone from Donald Trump when he talks about Ukraine. In a recent speech he gave, he talked about it being a very, very difficult problem and a lot more difficult than he thought. I think there is a realization among Trump and his inner circle that Ukraine cannot be solved quite so simply. So I am remaining quietly optimistic, not because I like Donald Trump or not because I agree with what he's doing, but I believe we need to understand what it is Donald Trump wants, and we need to do the best deal that we can because it's not just in Ukraine's interest. If Ukraine falls, we will all ultimately fall. We will all feel we will all feel the cost.
Let's make this the last question because it follows really well on from this, and it's not a triple or quadruple barreled question. This is just a double barreled one. Nice, simple question.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
It seems to me, and I've been listening, as you know, I listen to sort of 3 or 4 hours a day, at least of what I would call, Russian language, either diaspora media or, it would be Ukrainian commentators like Vitaly Portnikov, who broadcast in Russian. Alexei Goncharenko is interesting. Some of his little daily snapshots of what's going on. And people like Michael Naki and Vladimir Milov, who are two of the leading, say, opposition journalist in Russia and whose views I actually trust. You have to question everything. But so what they're suggesting is that what he dreams of is re-establishing Russia as a great power and the perception of it as a great power. And to crown that achievement, he would orchestrate a kind of Yalta of a new Yalta conference, but this time it's all dictators around the table or semi-dictators, and it'd be a new way of carving the world up. He announced it in 2007, and here we are. He's closer than ever to this dream. What is the risk of Putin getting Trump to attend such a conference and nominally agreeing to certain things, such as spheres of influence and a new world order, which precludes Ukraine and other smaller nations which are not seen as sovereign by Russia? What is the risk of such a conference taking place and Russia getting its way, reshaping the world in its own disordered, dog eat dog image?
If we allow Putin success in Ukraine, and at the moment we're not talking about taking over all of Ukraine and wiping Ukraine off the map as his ultimate gain, but we're talking about, say, freezing the war along current lines, and whatever security guarantees Ukraine would be given, they haven't been worth much in the past. If Putin can achieve that, then the risk of such a conference is huge. In fact, I would say it will definitely happen because this is really ending where we began on the rise of autocracies and the very precarious nature of our rules-based international order, which is what those autocracies despise and abhor the most. On the second part of the question, what is the chance of getting a Donald Trump to attend such a conference? I don't know. It seems to be above my pay grade, but my instinct at the moment is to say no. And I go back to what I said, talking about everybody does and says everything for a reason. So we need to understand what Donald Trump wants, and we need to understand what Vladimir Putin wants. So I'll repeat what I said. Vladimir Putin wants three things. One, he wants to put the Russian Empire back together. Two, he wants to keep America. To do that, he needs to do two things. He needs to keep America out of the game, and he needs to significantly weaken Europe and make sure that Europe does not become strong enough, which we can do. Remember, the combined economies of the European Union and Britain is probably between 10 and 11 times the size of the Russian economy. So I don't see a Donald Trump in that doomsday scenario attending such a conference. I might be wrong, but in my own doomsday scenario where we allow Putin any sort of a victory in Ukraine, he will come back for more, and I would certainly see such a Yalta, as you call it, type conference going ahead, with the world's foremost autocrats sitting around the table. The fact that China might be sitting around that table, I'm not quite sure how Trump would sit around the same table. So that's my that's my humble assessment of it. It's a very big risk, but I don't think it will go as far as I think Putin's realistic objective is to keep America out. I don't think that Putin's objective can realistically extend to actually taking America inside the tent. I pray to God I am correct.
Let's hope so. Well, we'll be following it closely. We've been following Trump's appointments closely as well, with some of our speakers who are close to Republican circles. And of course, it's a curious mixed bag. But we'll continue following this. We will pick up this discussion as events unfold. And hopefully in February, we'll have a chat with Philip Ingram as well. So we'll get together and pick through the bones of the latest news and developments. Then, Cormac, for now, it's a huge pleasure to speak once again. And thank you so much for your incisive and forceful views.
Jonathan, thank you for your time. As I said, it's always a great pleasure to chew the cud with you and to come on to Silicon Curtain and talk about some really important issues. Thank you very much.